The oppressive, suffocating humidity of the August afternoon hung heavy, a tangible weight over Patriots Landing, a sprawling, meticulously, almost unnaturally landscaped HOA community that aggressively billed itself in glossy brochures as an exclusive haven for distinguished residents. Jonathan Cole-Esquier, National Military Legal Advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, felt a familiar, unwelcome prickle of unease, a tightening in his gut, as he navigated his rental car through the community's ostentatiously grand-guarded entrance and approached the imposing faux colonial clubhouse. He was here not in his official high-powered capacity, a role that usually saw him advising four-star generals in secure Pentagon briefing rooms, but for a deeply personal, increasingly urgent reason to check on his old friend, his revered mentor, Colonel Michael "Mike" Rourke, U.S. Marine Corps, retired. Mike's daughter, Sarah, had called Jonathan that morning, her voice a thin, frayed wire of anxiety. "Jonathan, it's Dad." She'd managed her words tumbling out. "He's not answering his phone. He went out on his scooter hours ago, just to the duck pond, and the guards here, they've been awful to him lately." Escalating. "He said they threatened him yesterday. I'm terrified something's happened. Please, can you go? He'll listen to you." As Jonathan parked and strode towards the clubhouse, the diffuse source of his unease sharpened, coalesced, and then materialized with a sickening, visceral clarity. Two uniformed security guards from Eagle Eye Security Solutions, the HOA's notoriously aggressive and frequently complained about private security contractor, were flanking Colonel Rourke. The colonel, a man whose spirit Jonathan had always considered indomitable, was not on his familiar customized heavy-duty mobility scooter. Instead, he was slumped, looking diminished and exhausted, in a hard, unforgiving plastic chair inside the stuffy, windowless, and ironically named HOA Community Relations Office, a room that clearly doubled as Eagle Eye's makeshift, unofficial detention room. The door was slightly ajar, and Jonathan could hear the lead guard, a beefy, red-faced man whose prominent name tag read SGT Bishop, speaking in a loud, hectoring, deliberately demeaning tone. "And until you can provide a full and satisfactory explanation for your unauthorized presence in a clearly marked, restricted common area, and your subsequent belligerent, disrespectful attitude towards authorized security personnel acting in the performance of their duties, you will remain here, Colonel." The honorific Colonel was delivered with a sneering, contemptuous emphasis that made Jonathan's blood, already simmering, begin to boil. Unauthorized presence. Colonel Rourke's voice, though strained and hoarse, still held the gravelly, unmistakable timbre of command, a voice that had once rallied men under fire. "I was on the goddamned paved pathway by the damn duck pond, Bishop, a pathway I have used every single day for the 5 years I've lived in this overpriced, overregulated mausoleum. And my belligerent attitude, as you so delicately put it, was a direct and I believe entirely justified response to your young thug here." He gestured with a defiant lift of his chin towards the other younger, visibly nervous-looking guard, whose name tag identified him as Officer R. Davis. "Attempting to physically confiscate my legally owned and registered mobility scooter for improper parking on a public access path. That scooter is an unregistered vehicle under HOA bylaws, Rourke, and it's a hazard." Bishop retorted, his voice escalating, clearly enjoying his petty dominion. "And your repeated flagrant disregard for clearly posted community bylaws constitutes disorderly conduct and creates a persistent nuisance. We have every right under our contract with the Patriots Landing HOA to detain you for questioning and to ensure community order. This is private property, sir, and Eagle Eye Security is contracted and fully empowered to maintain that order, whether you like it or not." Jonathan had heard more than enough. The casual cruelty, the abuse of power, the utter disrespect. It was intolerable. He pushed the door open fully and stepped inside his presence, though he was dressed in unassuming civilian clothes, a well-cut but unremarkable charcoal suit, immediately commanding a sudden, startled silence. His demeanor honed by years of advising four-star generals, negotiating with hostile foreign diplomats, and navigating the treacherous high-stakes corridors of power in Washington, D.C., radiated an unshakable, almost palpable authority. "Sergeant Bishop." Jonathan said, his voice quiet, almost conversational, but carrying an edge of cold-tempered steel that few who heard it ever forgot. "On what specific legal authority, state statute, county ordinance, or legitimate contractual provision?" Are you or Officer Davis currently detaining Colonel Michael Rourke, a resident of this community, a decorated combat veteran of the United States Marine Corps against his will in this office, and without access to communication or counsel? Bishop, startled by the unexpected authoritative intrusion, whirled around his already florid face, flushing an even deeper, angrier red. "And who the hell are you, buddy?" he blustered, trying to regain his footing. "This is official HOA security business, private property. Butt out, civilian, before you find yourself joining him in that chair facing charges of interfering with an official investigation." Jonathan Cole allowed a small, almost imperceptible, and profoundly dangerous smile to touch the corners of his lips. "Actually, Sergeant," he replied, his voice remaining deceptively calm, "this situation has just as of this moment become a matter of grave and immediate concern to the United States military, and by extension, to the federal government of the United States. My name is Jonathan Cole. I am the National Military Legal Advisor to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And you, sir, by your actions here today, have just illegally detained, and by the Colonel's account, assaulted a highly decorated disabled American combat veteran on what appear to be entirely fabricated and retaliatory charges. You have flagrantly violated his fundamental civil rights, his specific rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and potentially several federal statutes regarding the intimidation and harassment of veterans. I strongly suggest you uncuff Colonel Rourke immediately. Then you, Officer Davis, and your employer, Eagle Eye Security Solutions, should prepare yourselves for a very thorough and, I suspect, very unpleasant conversation with federal investigators. Your day, Sergeant Bishop, and perhaps the entire future of your security company's lucrative contract here is about to take a dramatically different and significantly more complicated turn." The color drained from Bishop's beefy face, as if a plug had been pulled. The younger guard, Davis, looked like he was about to be physically ill, his eyes darting nervously between Jonathan Bishop and the door. And in the corner, observing the proceedings from a plush armchair with an air of smug, regal satisfaction, Mrs. Karen Sterling, the imperious, iron-fisted HOA president of Patriots Landing, suddenly looked like she'd swallowed a very large, very angry wasp. The carefully constructed, ruthlessly enforced order of Patriots Landing was about to be fundamentally and very, very publicly challenged. Jonathan Cole was a man whose life, whose very identity was defined by the law, particularly as it pertained to the rights, responsibilities, and welfare of the men and women of the United States Armed Forces. As the National Military Legal Advisor, a civilian position of immense trust and responsibility within the Department of Defense, he provided critical counsel to the highest echelons of military leadership, the Joint Chiefs themselves, the Secretary of Defense, often the White House, on a vast, complex, and ever-shifting array of intricate legal and ethical issues. These ranged from the interpretation of international treaties and the formulation of rules of engagement in active combat zones to the nuanced complexities of military justice to the fundamental rights and enduring welfare of service members, veterans, and their families. He had been a brilliant, tenacious legal strategist, a formidable, feared courtroom advocate in his younger days as a JAG officer, and was now in his maturity revered as a man of unshakable integrity, profound wisdom, and quiet, steely resolve. His friendship with Colonel Mike Rourke was a bond forged in shared experience and mutual respect, stretching back decades to when Jonathan was a young, somewhat green JAG officer, navigating his first challenging courts-martial, and Rourke was already a legendary, battle-hardened battalion commander, a leader revered by his Marines. Rourke had been more than just a senior officer. He had been a mentor, a moral compass, almost a father figure to the young lawyer, a man whose courage, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to his people Jonathan held in the deepest, most profound esteem. Colonel Rourke, a recipient of the Silver Star for extraordinary heroism under fire, multiple Purple Hearts for wounds sustained in the brutal jungles of Vietnam, and the burning sands of Desert Storm, was the epitome of the old-school, unbreakable Marine, tough as nails, fiercely principled, relentlessly independent, and possessed of a deeply ingrained, if sometimes gruffly expressed, sense of justice. His numerous combat injuries had over the years taken a terrible cumulative toll, leaving him with severe chronic mobility impairments. He was reliant on a specialized heavy-duty all-terrain mobility scooter for any distance beyond a few painful steps, and he battled constant debilitating pain with a quiet, uncomplaining stoicism that both awed and worried Jonathan. He had chosen Patriots Landing for his retirement years ago, persuaded by its glossy brochures, promising a peaceful, accessible, and supportive community where he could enjoy his later years with dignity and a degree of independence. His daughter Sarah, a compassionate ER nurse, lived nearby and visited often, a source of immense comfort, but the colonel, true to his nature, cherished his autonomy, his ability to still navigate his own life, however circumscribed. Patriots Landing, however, under the increasingly autocratic, almost tyrannical rule of its long-reigning HOA president, Mrs. Karen Sterling, and the thuggish, often brutal enforcement tactics of Eagle Eye Security Solutions, led by the puffed-up, power-tripping Sergeant Tom Bishop, was rapidly distressingly becoming anything but peaceful or supportive for Colonel Rourke, or for many other residents, particularly the elderly and disabled. Mrs. Sterling, a woman whose social standing, her meticulously maintained property, and her absolute control over the HOA were her primary, all-consuming concerns, viewed anything or anyone that deviated from her narrow, rigid, and entirely subjective definition of community perfection as a blight to be harassed, fined, and ultimately eradicated. She was infamous among dissenting residents for her vindictive, relentless pursuit of even the most trivial bylaw infractions, her public shaming of residents who dared to question her authority at HOA meetings, and her unwavering, almost sycophantic support for Eagle Eye Security's aggressive, often borderline illegal tactics, which she consistently publicly praised as effectively maintaining our exceptionally high community standards. Sergeant Bishop, a man whose considerable physique suggested far more time spent at the gym cultivating muscle mass than in any classroom learning about de-escalation constitutional rights or basic human decency, seemed to relish his role as Mrs. Sterling's primary enforcer, her personal strongman. He patrolled the pristine manicured pathways of Patriots Landing like a drill sergeant on a perpetual power trip. His interactions with residents, often laced with condescension, intimidation, and a barely concealed contempt for anyone he deemed out of line, disrespectful, or simply not deferential enough to his imagined authority. The inciting incident that had first drawn Jonathan Cole's direct, albeit initially informal and discreet attention to the escalating troubling situation at Patriots Landing had occurred several months prior. Colonel Rourke, a man not given to complaint, had called him his voice tight, with a rare, palpable display of controlled anger. He recounted how Sergeant Bishop, accompanied by another glowering Eagle Eye guard, had attempted to issue him a hefty, non-negotiable HOA fine for improperly and conspicuously displaying a military service flag from a small, unobtrusive flagpole on his own front porch. The flag in question was a small, respectfully displayed and entirely legal Marine Corps standard, a flag the colonel had served under and bled for over 30 years. Bishop, with breathtaking arrogance, had deemed it an unapproved, non-conforming decorative element that violated community aesthetic uniformity guidelines as per HOA Bylaw 7, subsection C. The colonel, a man of considerable restraint but finite patience, had in no uncertain and reportedly very colorful Marine Corps terms informed Sergeant Bishop precisely where he could file his citation and his aesthetic uniformity guidelines. The HOA, predictably under Mrs. Sterling's vindictive direction, had then escalated, threatening to place a lien on the colonel's property if the fine and associated administrative fees weren't paid promptly. Jonathan, upon hearing this, had made a few discreet, carefully worded calls to the HOA's retained legal counsel, gently but firmly reminding them of specific federal laws protecting the display of the American flag and official military service flags by residents. The citation and the threatened lien had been quietly, grudgingly withdrawn without apology. But it was crystal clear to Jonathan then that Mrs. Sterling and Sergeant Bishop now considered Colonel Mike Rourke a problem resident, a troublemaker, a nail that needed to be hammered down. The rising action of their targeted harassment had since become a relentless campaign of escalating petty tyrannies, a death-by-a-thousand-cut strategy seemingly designed to make the colonel's life so unpleasant, so restrictive, that he would either capitulate or leave. First, Bishop began to systematically, almost obsessively target Colonel Rourke's essential mobility scooter. He would leave multiple official-looking warning notices plastered on it for being parked in an unauthorized common area when the colonel left it for a few minutes by the community mailboxes while he retrieved his mail, or for exceeding the designated pathway speed limit. a speed limit Bishop seemed to invent and arbitrarily enforce, on the spot, often accompanied by a wagging finger and a condescending lecture. On one particularly disturbing occasion, the colonel found one of his scooter's specialized expensive puncture-resistant tires inexplicably completely flat, with no obvious puncture mark, just hours after a sharp verbal altercation with Bishop over access to a newly and without prior notice, restricted for ecological maintenance section of the Lakeside Promenade, a section the colonel had used for years for his daily morning constitutional, a small but vital ritual that helped him manage his chronic pain. The second and far more disturbing and humiliating incident had involved Colonel Rourke's long-standing weekly poker game. He and several other elderly veterans residents of Patriots Landing gathered every Thursday afternoon in a small, underused side room of the community clubhouse for a few hours of low-stakes poker. The gambling involved pennies, nickels, and dimes more for bragging rights than financial gain, and more importantly, for camaraderie, shared stories, and mutual support. Mrs. Sterling, citing vague, anonymous resident complaints about unauthorized gambling activities and disruptive, noisy behavior. The disruptive behavior was the occasional burst of hearty laughter. The noisy behavior, the click of poker chips, had dispatched Sergeant Bishop and another equally thuggish eagle-eye guard to summarily and very publicly shut down the game mid-hand. They had unceremoniously ejected the bewildered, humiliated veterans from the clubhouse, informing them in loud, carrying voices that their clubhouse privileges had been indefinitely suspended pending a full review by the HOA board. It was a calculated, deeply disrespectful, and profoundly cruel act, clearly designed to isolate the colonel and his friends, to make them feel unwelcome, ostracized, and powerless in their own community. Jonathan, upon hearing of this latest outrage from a distraught Sarah Rourke, had begun to seriously consider initiating more formal, aggressive legal intervention, but the colonel, proud, stubborn, and fiercely independent to a fault, had initially resisted, insisting he could and would fight his own battles. "I didn't survive Quezon and Fallujah to be run out of my own home by a tin-pot dictator with a clipboard and a couple of rent-a-thugs, Jonathan," he'd growled over the phone. The midpoint twist, the critical revelation that significantly deepened Jonathan's concern and hinted at a more organized, potentially corrupt, and far more sinister underpinning to Mrs. Sterling's and Sergeant Bishop's increasingly brazen actions, came not from his own investigations, but from an unexpected and very brave quarter. A young, idealistic, and increasingly troubled HOA board member, a man named David Chen, recently elected on a platform of transparency, fiscal responsibility, and resident rights, contacted Jonathan anonymously, his voice hushed and fearful. He was, he said, deeply disturbed, even horrified, by what he was witnessing behind the closed doors of HOA board meetings. He provided Jonathan with copies of internal HOA financial documents, meeting minutes, and confidential emails. These documents strongly suggested that Mrs. Sterling was personally receiving substantial undisclosed consulting fees or bonuses from Eagle Eye Security Solutions, a company whose security contract with Patriots Landing was significantly more expensive and whose documented performance record and resident complaint history were far poorer than those of previous, more reputable security providers. The documents also hinted at a far more insidious overarching plan, a plan apparently championed by Sterling and a secretive cabal of her developer cronies and allies on the board. This plan aimed to revitalize and rebrand Patriots Landing by systematically and, if necessary, ruthlessly pushing out long-term, less affluent residents, many of whom, like Colonel Rourke, were elderly or disabled veterans on fixed incomes occupying older, less valuable units. The goal was to make way for the construction of more luxury townhouses, expanded high-fee amenities, and a younger, wealthier demographic. Colonel Rourke, with his prominent visible disability, his outspoken, unyielding nature, his refusal to be intimidated, and his rallying effect on other dissatisfied residents, was a clear, significant, and increasingly problematic obstacle to this revitalization plan. He wasn't just a minor annoyance to Sterling and Bishop. He was a direct threat to their potentially illegal and certainly unethical lucrative agenda. A potential red herring had briefly and cleverly complicated matters a few weeks prior when a minor localized series of petty thefts from unlocked cars in the Patriots Landing visitor parking lot had occurred. Mrs. Sterling and Sergeant Bishop had immediately and very publicly seized upon this, using it as justification for demanding even more aggressive patrolling by Eagle Eye, random security checks of residents and their guests, and urgent proposals for significantly increased monthly security fees to fund more eagle-eye guards and new surveillance equipment. For a short time, it had seemed to some residents that the community's security issues were primarily external, thus deflecting attention from the ongoing escalating internal abuses of power. But Jonathan, now armed with the explosive information from David Chen, saw it as a convenient, perhaps even orchestrated smokescreen, a cynical way for Sterling and Bishop to further consolidate their control, justify their draconian tactics, an inflated budget, and intimidate any remaining opposition. He had been in the process of meticulously collating this evidence, preparing to present his findings to the State Attorney General's office, and to strongly advise Colonel Rourke on initiating a major federal civil rights lawsuit when Sarah, the Colonel's distraught daughter, had called him that Saturday morning, her voice frantic, laced with a terror Jonathan had rarely heard. Her father had gone for his usual early morning outing to the duck pond, a small but significant act of daily defiance against Bishop's increasing arbitrary restrictions, and hadn't returned. He wasn't answering his phone. She was terrified something had happened to him. Jonathan had dropped everything, his gut churning with a cold, sickening premonition of disaster, and had driven to Patriot's Landing immediately. A premonition that was now horrifically, undeniably realized in the stuffy, oppressive confines of the HOA administrative office. Uncuff him. Sergeant Bishop. Jonathan Cole repeated his voice, now devoid of any inflection, any artifice, resonating with the unmistakable, unyielding weight of absolute command. Do it now, or I will personally add felony obstruction of justice and interfering with a federal officer acting in his official capacity to the rapidly growing and very serious list of criminal charges you, your subordinate Officer Davis, your employer, Eagle Eye Security Solutions, and potentially members of this HOA board are about to face. Sergeant Bishop, his face now a pasty, unhealthy gray, his earlier bluster completely irrevocably gone, fumbled with the handcuff key, his thick, meaty fingers suddenly clumsy, uncoordinated. He finally managed to unlock the heavy steel restraints from Colonel Rourke's visibly bruised, swollen wrists. Officer Davis, the younger guard, looked like he wanted the earth to open up and swallow him whole. He was muttering almost incoherently, I just did what Sarge told me to do. I didn't know. He said it was HOA policy. I didn't want this. Sarge pushed me. Ignorance of the law, Officer Davis, or the pathetic excuse of simply following orders, is not and never has been a valid legal defense when you are actively participating in the violation of a United States citizen's fundamental constitutional rights. Jonathan said coolly, his gaze unwavering, not taking his eyes off the now deflated Bishop. He knelt beside Colonel Rourke, his expression softening with a deep, genuine concern that transcended their professional relationship. Mike, are you all right? Can you tell me exactly what happened? The colonel, leaning heavily against the hard plastic back of the chair, took several deep, ragged, painful breaths. His normally ruddy face was pale. His eyes, though still defiant, were filled with a mixture of acute pain, lingering righteous anger, and a profound, soul-deep weariness that cut Jonathan to the core. Jonathan, thank God you're here, son. These goddamn thugs. They ambushed me down by the pond, set me up. Bishop here. He gestured weakly with his chin towards the now cowering, sweating sergeant, started screaming at me right out of the blue about me being in a restricted access ecological preservation zone. A damn duck pond, for Christ's sake. A pond I visited almost every single day for 5 bloody years. Said my scooter was damaging the sensitive wetlands habitat. I was on the paved asphalt pathway, mind you. When I told him he was talking absolute certifiable nonsense, that he was exceeding his authority, he and this young fella Davis they grabbed me, accused me of resisting arrest, of threatening an officer. They wrestled me off my scooter, damn near broke my hip, dragged me in here kicking and screaming, I'm ashamed to say. Said they were detaining me pending the arrival of local law enforcement for formal arrest and processing. Been locked in this damn sweatbox for over an hour, maybe 2. They took my phone, refused to let me call Sarah or my lawyer. They did what? Jonathan's voice was dangerously soft, a quiet rumble that promised a storm, unlawful detention, false imprisonment, assault and battery, coercion, all perpetrated under the flimsy, fraudulent color of HOA authority against a disabled elderly combat veteran. This was beyond outrageous. This was a textbook federal civil rights case waiting to explode. He slowly rose and turned his icy gaze upon Mrs. Karen Sterling, the HOA president, who had been hovering anxiously near the doorway, her face a mask of barely suppressed fury, rapidly crumbling bravado, and dawning abject panic. Mrs. Sterling, Jonathan said, his tone cutting like a surgeon's scalpel. Were you aware, madam, that your contracted security guards were illegally detaining Colonel Rourke, a resident in good standing of this community, a decorated combat veteran of the United States, against his will on what appear to be entirely fabricated and retaliatory charges, and systematically denying him access to legal counsel or even basic communication with his family? Mrs. Sterling drew herself up, her carefully applied expensive lipstick a slash of defiant crimson against her suddenly pale, strained face. Mr. Cole, she began, her voice attempting its usual imperious, commanding hauteur, though it trembled almost uncontrollably. This is my community, Mr. Cole. And while this entire situation is most regrettable, I assure you that Sergeant Bishop and Officer Davis were acting in good faith and entirely within the scope of their contractual duties, enforcing community bylaws that are designed to protect our valuable natural resources and to ensure the continued safety, tranquility, and high property values for all our residents. Colonel Rourke, unfortunately, has been persistently uncooperative and frankly quite belligerent on several previous occasions regarding these reasonable and necessary bylaws. Perhaps a somewhat firmer hand was regrettably required to make him finally understand his obligations as a member of this community. A firmer hand, Mrs. Sterling, Jonathan repeated, his eyebrows arching in disbelief, his voice dripping with unconcealed contempt. Is that what you call forcibly, violently removing a disabled elderly man from his essential mobility scooter, physically assaulting him, and then illegally locking him in an office for over an hour on demonstrably baseless, trumped-up accusations? That is not enforcing bylaws. Madam, that is a series of criminal acts, and your pathetic, self-serving, good faith assertion is about to be severely and very publicly tested by federal investigators. Because you see, Mrs. Sterling, my role as National Military Legal Advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff involves, among many other things, ensuring that the hard-won rights of our nation's service members and veterans are vigorously protected, not just on foreign battlefields, but right here at home, in communities that purport to welcome them, communities like Patriots Landing. And what has happened here today to Colonel Rourke is a profound, egregious, and utterly unacceptable violation of those sacred rights. So, he paused, then just as Mrs. Sterling opened her mouth to retort, a new voice, sharp and laced with outrage, cut through the tense atmosphere. She's lying. She's lying about all of it. Sterling is taking bribes from Eagle Eye. She's been trying to force out the colonel for months. All heads swiveled towards the doorway. Standing there, clutching a thick manila envelope, his face pale but resolute, was David Chen, the young HOA board member. He strode into the room, his eyes blazing. I couldn't stay silent anymore, Jonathan. Colonel Rourke, Mrs. Sterling, Sergeant Bishop, they're all in on it. Sterling gets kickbacks from Eagle Eye to inflate their contract and look the other way on their tactics. And they have a plan, a revitalization scheme to harass and drive out older residents, especially veterans like the colonel, so they can build more luxury units. It's all here. He thrust the envelope towards Jonathan. Emails, financial statements, secret meeting minutes. I copied everything. Sterling knows I suspected something. She's probably trying to destroy the originals as we speak. The revelation hung in the air, explosive. Sterling gasped, her face turning from pale to a mottled, furious red. Lies, slander. This is a disgruntled rogue board member. He's fabricating this. You'll regret crossing me. Cole, you'll all regret it. Bishop looked utterly poleaxed. Davis just stared, wide-eyed. Jonathan took the envelope from Chen, his expression grim. Thank you, Mr. Chen. Your courage is commendable. He then pulled out his secure, encrypted satellite phone, the direct line that connected him to the highest levels of the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice. I am now making a formal priority notification to the U.S. Attorney's Office Civil Rights Division, and to the FBI Public Corruption Unit regarding potential violations of multiple federal laws, including conspiracy to deprive civil rights, assault, false imprisonment, wire fraud, and honest services fraud by members of Eagle Eye Security Solutions and specific members of the Patriots Landing HOA Board, including its president. I am also concurrently notifying the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff about the outrageous criminal mistreatment of a distinguished retired Marine Corps colonel by your private security force and HOA leadership. You can expect a rather robust and very swift federal response, Mrs. Sterling, very, very shortly. The color drained completely irrevocably from Mrs. Sterling's face. FBI, DOJ, Secretary of Defense. The names, the implications, the sudden catastrophic collapse of her carefully constructed corrupt little kingdom were clearly more than she had ever bargained for in her reign of petty tyranny. Her meticulously maintained world of rules, intimidation, and illicit profit was about to come crashing down around her, burying her in its ruins. Jonathan then made another more prosaic call, this time to the local Haven County Sheriff's Office, requesting the immediate dispatch of sworn law enforcement officers to take formal custody of Sergeant Bishop and Officer Davis and to secure the HOA office as an active crime scene. He also requested paramedics to evaluate Colonel Rourke, who was now looking even paler, the adrenaline clearly wearing off. Sarah Rourke arrived then, having been alerted by Chen, and rushed to her father's side, her face a mixture of relief and fury. While they waited for the sheriff's deputies, Jonathan turned his attention back to the two thoroughly demoralized Eagle Eye guards. Sergeant Bishop, Officer Davis. He said, his voice now devoid of all inflection, save for a cold, hard, implacable authority. You are both, as of this moment, under formal investigation for multiple state and federal felonies. You will surrender your duty belts, any and all weapons you are currently carrying, and your company identification credentials to me now. You will then remain seated and absolutely silent until Haven County Sheriff's deputies arrive to take you into official custody. Any attempt to leave this room, to communicate with anyone outside this room via any means, or to damage or destroy any potential evidence will result in additional, very serious federal charges. Do you understand me clearly? Bishop, his face a mask of sullen, impotent resentment, but his eyes filled with a dawning, undeniable fear, nodded mutely, his bravado shattered. Officer Davis, trembling visibly, just stammered, "Yes, sir, I didn't mean to hurt him, sir. Colonel, I'm so sorry." He looked genuinely remorseful, a pawn in a much larger, uglier game. The colonel just stared at him, his expression unreadable. They slowly, reluctantly unbuckled their belts, placing their sidearms, tasers, handcuffs, radios, and body cams on the small, cheap Formica table. The symbols of their recently abused and now forfeited authority now lay inert, tagged as evidence in a rapidly escalating multi-agency federal case. The arrival of several Haven County Sheriff's deputies, followed closely by a team of calm professional paramedics, brought a semblance of legitimate lawful order to the chaotic scene. Colonel Rourke, though visibly shaken, bruised and in considerable pain, refused to be taken to the hospital until he had given a full detailed and remarkably lucid statement to the deputies, his old Marine Corps discipline, his ingrained sense of duty kicking in despite his ordeal. Jonathan stayed by his side throughout, ensuring his rights were protected, his account accurately and respectfully recorded, while Sarah held his hand, her presence a quiet source of strength. As Sergeant Bishop and a tearful Officer Davis were led away in handcuffs by the stern-faced deputies, their faces a mixture of shocked disbelief and dawning, palpable terror, Jonathan Cole made one final call, this one, to the corporate headquarters of Eagle Eye Security Solutions, asking to speak directly to the CEO. His message, when delivered, was brief, concise, and chillingly clear. This is Jonathan Cole, National Military Legal Advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Your company's multi-million-dollar security contract with the Patriots Landing HOA is for all intents and purposes terminated as of this moment due to gross willful misconduct, criminal endangerment conspiracy, and multiple egregious violations of federal and state law by your on-site personnel and their supervisors. You can expect a full top-to-bottom audit of your company's operations, your training protocols, your hiring practices, your contractual agreements, and your financial records by multiple state and federal authorities commencing immediately. I strongly suggest you retain excellent and very expensive legal counsel. You are going to need it." He then hung up. The fallout was immediate, far-reaching, and devastating for the perpetrators. Jonathan Cole, true to his word, unleashed a legal and regulatory firestorm that reverberated from Patriots Landing to Washington, D.C. The U.S. Attorney's Office launched a full-scale, aggressive civil rights investigation into Eagle Eye Security Solutions nationwide and into the Patriots Landing HOA leadership. The FBI's Public Corruption Task Force began meticulously probing the financial irregularities, bribery, and potential racketeering activities that Jonathan's anonymous informant David Chen, who was now receiving federal protection, had so courageously exposed. The Department of Defense, publicly outraged by the criminal mistreatment of Colonel Rourke and the systemic issues it revealed, initiated its own comprehensive review of housing communities that catered to or were located near military veteran populations, demanding stricter oversight, accountability measures, and mandatory training standards for any private security firms operating in such communities. Sergeant Tom Bishop and Officer Davis were indicted on multiple federal charges, including conspiracy to deprive civil rights, under color of law assault, and false imprisonment. Davis, facing overwhelming evidence, and offered a plea deal in exchange for his full cooperation and testimony against Bishop and Sterling, quickly agreed. Bishop, arrogant and defiant to the end, was convicted on all counts and received a lengthy federal prison sentence. Mrs. Karen Sterling, after a thorough, painstaking investigation into her complex financial dealings, her orchestration of the harassment campaign, and her clear role in enabling and encouraging Bishop's reign of terror, was also indicted on a slew of serious federal charges, including conspiracy, honest services, wire fraud, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The evidence against her, including David Chen's damning documents, Davis's testimony, financial records, and the courageous, compelling testimony of Colonel Rourke and numerous other harassed residents of Patriots Landing, was overwhelming. She, too, was convicted and sentenced to a significant term in federal prison. Her social standing shattered, her reputation in ruins. The Patriots Landing HOA, as it was then constituted, collapsed under the crushing weight of federal sanctions, multiple resident lawsuits, and public disgrace. A court-appointed receiver took over, tasked with reforming its governance and restoring trust. Eagle Eye Security Solutions, facing dozens of similar lawsuits across the country, as other victims were emboldened to come forward, and with its already tarnished reputation now irreparably destroyed, had its operating licenses revoked in multiple states and eventually declared bankruptcy, its name becoming a notorious byword for corporate malfeasance, thuggery, and corruption in the private security industry. More importantly, the Patriots Landing case and the harrowing ordeal of Colonel Rourke became a powerful, galvanizing national symbol of HOA overreach, the dangers of unchecked private security power, and the urgent need to protect vulnerable residents, especially elderly and disabled veterans. It became a catalyst for meaningful, lasting change. Jonathan Cole, working tirelessly behind the scenes with veterans advocacy groups, dedicated members of Congress, and concerned state legislators across the country, spearheaded a nonpartisan movement for comprehensive reform. New federal guidelines were established for HOAs in communities with significant veteran populations, mandating strict ADA compliance, regular disability sensitivity training for board members and staff, and the establishment of clear, accessible, and independent grievance procedures. States began to pass Colonel Rourke's Law, a model piece of legislation that specifically protected veterans and individuals with disabilities from harassment, intimidation, and illegal detention by private security forces, and dramatically increased the civil and criminal penalties for such offenses. Stricter national standards for the training, psychological screening, certification, and ongoing oversight of all private security personnel were finally implemented with real teeth for enforcement. Colonel Mike Rourke, after a long and arduous period of physical and emotional recovery, his spirit bruised but ultimately unbroken, became an unlikely, reluctant, but incredibly powerful and effective advocate for veterans' rights and disability rights. His quiet dignity, his unwavering testimony, his simple, profound honesty inspired many. He even eventually, with Sarah's encouragement and Jonathan's quiet support, resumed his daily outings to the duck pond at a reformed and chastened Patriots Landing. His new state-of-the-art mobility scooter, a gift from a grateful veterans organization, was now a potent symbol of resilience, defiance, and enduring strength rather than perceived vulnerability. He was often accompanied by other veterans and residents from Patriots Landing who had found their own voices, their own courage in the wake of the scandal that had rocked their community and changed it fundamentally for the better. Sometimes, David Chen would join them. Jonathan Cole returned to his demanding critical role in Washington, the Patriots Landing case, a stark, indelible reminder of the constant, unwavering vigilance required to protect the rights, the dignity, and the honor of those who had served and sacrificed for the nation. He felt a lingering guilt for not acting sooner, for not seeing the storm clouds gathering over his friend before the lightning struck. That guilt would fuel his future efforts. He knew that laws and regulations, no matter how well-intentioned or comprehensive, could not entirely eradicate prejudice, greed, or the insidious abuse of power. But he also knew, with an absolute, unshakable conviction, forged in the crucible of that ugly August afternoon, that one person standing firm for justice, backed by the full weight of the law and the moral authority of a grateful nation, could indeed move mountains, could indeed make a profound difference, ensuring that havens for distinguished residents and for all citizens were truly havens of respect, dignity, safety, and justice for all, especially for those who had already sacrificed so much. The arrogant, thuggish commands of Sergeant Bishop in that stuffy, oppressive HOA office had been silenced, replaced by a much stronger, much clearer, and much more just national voice, demanding accountability reform and unwavering respect for the rule of law. And that Jonathan Cole knew with a weary but profound satisfaction was a victory well worth fighting for. He looked forward to his next quiet visit with Mike, just two old friends by the duck pond, the colonel likely grumbling, "Thanks, kid, you did good,"